Okay, so now I'm going to apply those same techniques to the creature that I designed, that I've brought into my fantasy landscape. Now, the only difference being that my fantasy landscape has a ton of different elements to it already and isn't just a flattened background. But if I wanted to make it a flattened background, I certainly could. So I'll show you what I mean. So I brought in my creature and I tried it there, and it was a little too like front and center. So I like it kind of in the corner a little bit more. So I put it there, right? And once I have my creature in, I'm hoping that it's as cleaned up as possible, nice and in sharp focus, because you can always take focus away, but it's very hard to add focus. And then the first thing I have to think about, matching our steps, is there any foreground element that can be in front of my creature to help set them in? And there isn't a foreground element, but there is water. If he's standing in the water there, that water is going to be overlapping his foot, and most of his tail is going to be kind of hitting the water, or some of it's underwater. So how can I do that? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is turn off my creature layer and then make a new merged layer of everything together that's behind it. Holding down Option and then going to Layer Merge Visible. So now I have one merged layer that's everything. And then I still have underneath it, though I have to turn them all off, I have all the components, should I ever need to use them. Okay, so now I basically have my creature, and I have one flat background. How do I put foreground elements over? I use my lasso tool, and I lasso around what's going to be overlapping my creature. And then I'm on the background layer, and I duplicate, Command J. Then I move that up and above my creature. And then I can take the opacity down because the water is transparent, right? And then I can also use my eraser and soften that edge. So just like I used a hard edge to erase out the rock, I'm going to use a very soft edge to blend out the seam of the water. Now, water is tricky because when we get to an edge with water, we might also have some distortion in it and water ripples. And so that's going to be something I have to deal with my texture fill. And I want maybe about that much of his tail in the water. So you see that does make a difference. But I'll also try to get a texture fill right at the seam of the water so he's disturbing it a little bit. All right, next, what about the lighting and the shadow of my creature? So to match that same technique, I'm going to duplicate him. I'm going to go up to Levels, Image Adjustment Levels. I'm going to make him a full silhouette by pushing all these sliders all the way to the right and the highlight output slider all the way the other way. Now I'm going, because he's directly on something, it's going to be directly underneath. So I'm going to transform and flip vertical. Get a mirror image, pull it down. I'm more interested in where that tail touches. And then I'll use perspective to flatten it out with the plane of the viewpoint a little bit more. Line it up at the bottom of that tail, bottom of the feet, that's working. And now I can use distort to pull it one side or the other. And the lighting's kind of coming from this direction. So the shadow's going to be opposite that. And distort's helpful for getting it to match up with the feet. That looks pretty good. From there to there, pretty big difference. All right, now I want to blur out that shadow a little bit. And I can do Gaussian blur for just a little bit of blur, especially because it's underwater as well. But then I want to use the smudge tool, nice and big and strong and soft edged, to push that shadow where it needs to be, going over the different terrain under the water. And to push it out of the way, like it shouldn't be on top of the foot that's casting it. Now, if the smudge tool takes forever to work for you, it does take quite a bit of processing, and we're working with high resolution images here. So if it goes really slow, you might just want to go right to the eraser instead. All right, so now I'm going to go to the eraser, low opacity eraser, soft edge, large. It gets darker and darker as it gets closer to its source. And now I'm going to turn off my background layer, and I can see what I've added in. And I need to make sure that I can still see the foot, even though it's under the water. So the bottom edge of the foot should be in shadow, but not the whole foot. All right. Something like that. And I might soften this edge a little bit more, or smudge it a little bit more. Bring it in. Okay, and then ultimately that shadow should probably not be at 100% opacity. You take its opacity down to match what you need. Okay, so this is what I have so far with the shadow underneath. Now I'm going to do the overlay layer, where I can play with the lighting on my character as well as some of the lighting on the landscape. So I make a new layer over and above everything. I say edit fill. This is a requirement for this project. With 50% gray, change that setting to overlay. And now I'm going to dodge and burn in the essentials view of the tools on my character. And the first thing that I will burn are some of the midtones on this side to make sense of that lighting coming from behind. And sometimes this can just improve your overall character. So by just dodging the midtones between 20 and 30 exposure, it's not going to push anything to black. It's just going to deepen them. And then if I need to, with highlights, I can burn those down as well, just a little bit. Like on the surface of the feet here. Now what is that looking like? You can see that difference on the head and belly and on the legs. Right now, I can dodge and help these highlights stand out. Because if I squint, he's kind of darker than his environment. So I'm going to dodge the midtones, again, nice and big, and get the back edge of him. We don't need to follow perfect light logic, but we want it to be convincing. And this is sunlight. This is pretty bright. And why I like doing it on an overlay layer is I can always just play with the opacity of this and decide what's the right fit. Because I tend to overdo it with dodge and burn. So I have to decide that's correct. That shows me how I've changed my character, right? To fit this setting. Okay, what's next? some of those texture fills. So this is a trickier one. Let me see, I'll try water ripples. And instead of just finding photos of them, I'm trying for the texture fill, something I can use, something from the right distance, and the right angle. Water is very particular. This has some promise. So does this. All right, and then I can even, this is something to consider, I can even use a water splash for the tail troubling the water. And these are just textures. I'm just looking for large images. I'm not looking for 8 megapixels. Save them off to the desktop. I don't know if they'll all be useful, but I can use them pretty freely. Okay. Now I bring them over the top. So first, let's try this one for the water. And I'm going to play with its perspective and flatten it out. Bring it down over where the shadow is. I might rotate it a little bit. And then I'm going to erase out with 100% opacity, soft edge brush, some of these edges. But I have to rasterize it to be able to do that. All right, now let's play with the opacity. And let's find out where I need that. Now, water that is troubled is more opaque than water that is calm. So the water looks pretty calm back here, but as we get closer and closer, I want it to be more and more troubled. So let me take my opacity down now that I have a soft edge. Let me gradate that sense of troubling the water, especially around the tail and the feet. Make that clear. Now you can barely see the feet under there, but it definitely helps integrate my creature into this setting. I could probably get away with a little less, or I could try a blending mode like Pinlight. And I can combine that with a soft light to just show those ripples and maybe just blur that a little bit. That soft light layer. And probably that pin light layer too. That's a little too much blurring. Let's see. Why I like Gaussian blur is you can control it precisely how much you want it to take the edge off of things. Now water is blurry even in the foreground slightly just because it's moving all the time. So if we see it too sharp, it's because it's a high-speed photo. And then that's not really the illusion I'm going for. All right, so I've got him stepping in the water. I've got his shadows making more sense. Now I can just play with the overall atmosphere and help him stand out a little bit from this background, maybe adding a little bit more mist into the background.